pass this over to Alex. So here we go.
Thank you very much, Mike. And before we start, thank you to those of you that are listening and listening to this webinar. And I hope that you enjoy the next hour and are able to learn a lot from it. My name's Alex Brown. As you can possibly tell, I'm actually originally from the UK, and I actually now reside in England, in the southwest corner of England. I've spent my entire career mostly in the MBA admissions space. I started off at the University of Delaware for 7 years. Then I moved on to the Wharton School as part of the University of Pennsylvania, and I was at Wharton for 7 years as a senior associate director of admissions. And since that time, I've been at Clear Admit, I think at least for about 12 years. During my time at Wharton and some of my time at my time at Wharton, I also taught for the Graduate Management Admissions Council to new admissions representatives coming into the industry. So I have a long history with this industry. I love it. I'm passionate about it, and I hope some of the things that I impart with you today sort of illustrates and shows that. I'm also a bit of a teacher. I've taught marketing courses for a lot of years. So hopefully the teaching aspect helps too. So Mike, if you move along, Mike is actually driving the slide deck so that I don't mess it up. So what I wanted to start off with, one of the things you need to think about is whether you should apply in the first round. And there are lots of speculation that the first round is easier to get into or it's harder to get into if you apply in the first round. The better candidates apply for the first round, so that might make it difficult, and so on and so forth. So let me sort of dive into whether you should be applying in the first round. One of the main reasons to do that is you do actually get your results sooner. You'll get them for the most schools the end of December. Well, actually not the end of December, like sort of around December 15 to 20, before our traditional holiday sort of period. And that's advantageous because then you can adjust your strategy if you're not successful for round 2 applications, or you can adjust your strategy if you're wildly successful and adjust up and apply to some other schools. So one of the fundamental reasons to apply in round 1 is you learn the results sooner. I would say, however, that there's no real competitive advantage applying in the first round versus the second round. Clearly, you want to apply before the final rounds. The final rounds are going to be used by the top schools just to fill in gaps. So you're at a whim. You're at the whim of sort of how their season has been that year, and if they're looking for certain types of candidates at that point, if you don't fit that profile, it really doesn't matter how good you are, you're not going to be successful. So applying the first 2 rounds, applying the first round to get your results sooner. That all said, the big caveat is if you're part of a competitive profile and you can put a great application together for the first round, you should do so. And the obvious competitive profile that we often focus on is if you're sort of Indian national with a sort of an IT background, male, and so on and so forth. It's not that schools don't want you, they clearly do, but there are a lot of you out there that have great, great applications, so you're competing with a lot of similar people. So from that perspective, you're encouraged to apply in the first round. So if you're part of a competitive profile, absolutely do it if you can. The key, though, to all of this is if you're ready for the first round. As Mike alluded, the first round starts in a couple of weeks. Harvard is the first of the top US schools round 1 deadlines. I think ESE in Europe actually has an early decision deadline a day before Harvard to kick the season off into sort of high gear. You can be applying to Columbia now through early decision. They're already reviewing applications. But the key is, are you ready? Will your application be strong in the first round, or will it be stronger in the second round? You need to figure that out. And the reality is there is a learning curve to this process. So your stronger applications will be the latter ones that you submit, just through the fact that you've learned more about the process yourself and so on and so forth. So anyway, those are some of the issues in terms of applying in round one. So Mike, next slide. School selection. Presumably, if you are applying in round one, you've already gone through the process of identifying schools that you're going to apply to. But there are broad sort of reasons that should help drive that choice. Firstly, the sort of competitiveness, you could call it the ranking, I suppose, the prestige of the school. And I've sort of highlighted three bullets to sort of separate top schools. And this webinar is sort of targeted to candidates considering the very sort of elite MBA programs. So let me ask, I'll throw out a quick poll question. I think Mike can throw this one out there very quickly. How many of you are applying to Harvard or Stanford? Not and, or. So if you're considering applying to Harvard or Stanford, just click yes. If you're not, click no. If you're undecided at this time, then you can click that option 2. But let's sort of learn very quickly how many of you are applying to one of those two institutions. Harvard, obviously, up in Boston, Stanford on the West Coast, are considered, and we have data that sort of backs this up through our Decision Wire platform. Harvard and Stanford are the top 2 programs in the world. And some rankings will sort of agree with that. Oddly, some rankings don't, which makes you wonder the credibility of those rankings, but there you go. So 35% of you are, so you're applying to the very, very best. 55% of you are planning not to, so you've decided to not target the very best, which is fine. Obviously, I worked at Wharton for a lot of years, so I got to say, you know, they're right up there, right? But so some of you may be considering them. But in terms of from a competitiveness standpoint, Harvard and Stanford I would put sort of in a league of their own. I would say Wharton's right behind them, and then the rest of the M7. The M7 is and it stands for Magnificent Seven, but it's sort of Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, the 3, and then you've got Kellogg and MIT, and you've got University of Chicago's Booth, and you've got Columbia, right? So that's the M7. That would be the next tier of sort of competitiveness. And then you've got the top 16, which would include schools like Duke and Ross, and so on and so forth. So on and so forth, being like Darden and Cornell and Anderson and Stern and such. And then the top 22 might include schools like Texas and Emory and such. And you'll notice I haven't mentioned any of the European schools nor other schools around the world. And there's a reason for that. It's actually quite difficult to compare schools from broad geographies, different geographies. So for somebody, a school like London Business School, if they plan a career in Europe or in London in the finance or consulting sector, London Business School would be a very credible choice right up against Harvard and Stanford. But if you're planning a career in the West Coast of the United States, then London Business School might not be as competitive for you as a school like Berkeley Haas or Anderson or something like that, right? So competitiveness in terms of school selection is important. Geography and recruiting is actually super, super important. So when you're thinking of the school that you're planning to apply, you really need to think long and hard about your career goals and which of the schools best set up for you to execute on those goals. And part of those career goals are going to be, where do you want to be post-MBA? So if you want to be on the West Coast in Silicon Valley, then obviously Stanford and Haas have very strong networks in Silicon Valley. So on the west coast side, you've got this sort of emerging tech center of what I call a center of business gravity that's over the last 10, 15 years has really grown to be a very attractive magnet for MBA candidates. The East Coast has traditionally been a very strong center of gravity, and there are lots of business schools that serve the East Coast with strong networks. But if that's where you want to be, obviously you've got Harvard, you've got Wharton, you've got Columbia, and you've got Stern, and you've got a number of other schools serving that sort of center of gravity. Then you've got that sort of Midwest Chicago, where you've got Kellogg and University of Chicago, Ross, and a couple of others. And some might argue actually that as a center of gravity is weakening a little bit. But nevertheless, you could go to Kellogg, and it has a very strong sort of consulting program, and sort of end up in New York or California or wherever. That's perfectly fine. But then you've got to think about, well, would I have been better off actually being in Columbia and networking during my MBA whilst I was at Columbia if I really want to be in New York, and so forth. So geography and recruiting would really help, should really drive those decisions. And you'll notice, and this is made very clear actually in Clear Admit school guides, that we are now, actually, this is a bit of a plug, but they're freely available if you register for the site. But what they do make clear is most top schools even have a massive geography bias towards their local region in terms of where they place their candidates. So absolutely bear that in mind. And then the other thing about school selection would be fit. So do you want to go to a school, a large program, a small program, urban versus rural, different teaching methods, whether you want to follow the case study at Harvard and Darden versus lectures and so on and so forth. And really, to get a good understanding of fit, visiting schools is the right way to go. And actually, visiting schools is fundamental to your MBA admissions research if you can visit schools. Absolutely, we would push you to do that. All right, so that's a little bit about school selection. But again, I think at this stage, you should be pretty clear, if you are applying to round one, which schools you're targeting. You're also sort of somewhat down the road of actually drafting out and completing those applications. So Mike, next slide.
Yes, Alex, would you want to do the how many applications poll as well?
Oh yeah. Why don't we throw that one out there? Yes. Very good. Thank you, Mike, for reminding me that I wanted to do that. So before we move on, how many applications are you planning to submit in for round one? So if you could just answer that real quickly, sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, more than 4, none for this year, just interested in what's going on, or I guess none for round one, I suppose. You could answer it with that, and you're here to learn a bit more to use for round two, because a lot of the advice that I'm going to go into now will be relevant for round two and so forth. So what we've got, 2, 3, 4, more than 4, very good. So more than 4, that's quite ambitious, I would say. On average, people apply to maybe 5 or 6 programs in total, and not all those programs necessarily have to be in one round. So you could apply to half your programs in round 1, half your programs in round 2, selecting a broad range of schools in round 1 to see where you're at based on the results. Boom, then round 2 are more targeted focus possibly. But that gives us a little bit of an inkling there. And what I forgot to mention off this slide before we do move to the next slide is when you're looking at competitiveness, that first point, one strategy that a lot of people adopt is to apply to what they might call a reach school. So a school they think might be a little bit beyond their competitiveness themselves, but they have a go, and they might also apply to a safety school. So a school that they think, well, you know what, if I don't get into into schools, at least I've got this one, and I can go to an MBA. So they might be targeting a school that they think they can get into more easily. So that's a common strategy, although you wouldn't apply to a safety school that you absolutely wouldn't go to if that was your only choice, because what's the point? That's a lot of money and effort invested into no real benefit. Okay, so let's move on, Mike, please. Okay, so now let's look at the admission process. And this is a really important slide. So I want you to think about this long and hard. I mean, my first question is, are you good enough when you think of these different schools? So those of you that have targeted Harvard and Stanford, or if you're going to the next tier, the M7 or whatever. And the AdCom, of which I was a long-time member, we're going to look at your professional record, we're going to look at your non-professional record, so we'll look at sort of activities and hobbies and various other things, and we'll look at your academics. So if you're smart enough to not get bogged down in the curriculum. We don't want people that are struggling in the curriculum, because if they're struggling, then they're not going to take advantage of the extracurriculars, the career services, and various other things that are important. So those are sort of things we're going to look at in a broad sense, and we're going to, or I say we, I'm obviously not an AdCom anymore, so I apologize, but they're going to look at your data forms, your essays, your recommendations, and your interview to sort of assess your professional record, non-professional, and your academics. And they're going to basically look at things like, are your experiences, both professional and non-professional, are they rigorous? How do they compare with the experiences of your fellow candidates? So they're going to look at the sort of the rigor of your experiences. They're also going to look to see how you differentiate yourself from other candidates, whether that's from your professional profile, your personal profile, your hobbies, your interests. How are you a little bit different? You really want to try to figure that out. And then you also, sort of the opposite to that, how will you fit in? So you want to show that you're going to get to their school, you're going to get really involved and fit in, and this, that, and the other. So by being very different, so overemphasizing the differentiation on that sort of different profile, I could use my mouse and go there, you might actually not fit in, right? So you have to sort of come to that balance. So those sort of things we're looking for in the sort of the big picture. The reality is, you might be good enough to get in, but there are way more good enough candidates than there are seats in these top MBA programs. And that's a really, really important point. Just because you're good enough, let's say 50, 60, or 70% of the candidates that apply are good enough to get in, but the admit rate's 20%. They've got to filter out a lot of good enough people to get the class that they want, right? So that's reality. And the reason for that is, there's lots of information out there on the internet about what these programs are looking for. So there's lots of self-selection. So the majority of candidates are good enough. That's the reality. So you have to step it over that mark in terms of getting in. So that's one important point to bear in mind as you go through the application process. It's not just good enough to be good enough, right? The second very crucial point is making sure you convey to each of the schools that you apply that you will attend. And that seems a little disingenuous, because you can't attend all 5 or 6 programs you're applying to. But at this point, you haven't been admitted anywhere. You want to make sure every school really does believe that they are a great choice for you, right? So schools want to admit candidates that want to attend. And you'll find some schools, and I'm not here naming and shaming, but some schools will be aggressively use the wait list to weed out some candidates that might well be superstars, but they're like, well, you know what, I'm not sure that we're going to be a good top choice for them, so we'll stick them on the wait list and see how they respond. And if they don't respond aggressively, we'll know that they've gone somewhere else. So how do you overcome this issue of convincing schools, will you attend? Make sure you do your research. Make sure you understand how you're a good fit for each of the programs you're applying. If you can, the best way to do this is to visit. Visit, connect with people, build relationships, if you can. Obviously, based on some people's location, they can't all do this. But you really do have to overcome this issue of, will you attend? There are very few schools that don't worry about this issue, and you can guess, maybe throw out in chat, which schools don't worry about whether you will attend as an issue. In chat, Harvard, 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 Stanford, Harvard, Harvard, right? The very top schools, because they know they're the best. right? So if you're applying to one of the other M7 schools or a top 16 or whatever, and you're a superstar candidate, they're going to be like, well, you know what, I could say, has probably also applied to Harvard or something. So we got to see why she thinks we are a great fit for her, right? So there you go. All right, next slide, please, Mike. But that's very important point to keep in mind when you're applying to top schools. So are you admissible? So this slide is basically, are you good enough to attend, right? So that whole idea that 60 or 70% of people that apply to these top programs could get in and could go through the curriculum and do well academically, right? So it's a numbers game, right? So what is your undergrad? Your grade point average or its equivalent in your home country. If you have data points that you can offer, like your rank, your progression, your GPA, and so forth, these are all things that the AdCom is going to look at. They're going to look at the type of degree that you undertook, you know, an engineering degree versus a liberal arts degree, and so on and so forth. They're going to look at university you graduated from. So was it an Ivy League university? That'd be very good. Or an equivalent to an Ivy League university, or was a university like University of Delaware, where I worked for a while. So if you graduated there from an undergrad, but then you went on with a spectacular career afterwards, it says something about you. It says that you were very resourceful to get career opportunities that perhaps you know, other people from similar universities weren't able to acquire. So how are you able to do that? So all these data points tell stories, and the AdCom is trying to piece together your story by viewing it all. So your undergraduate record, and you can look at the top schools and look at their average GPAs. It's ridiculously high. Everybody applying is pretty smart. Have you taken additional coursework? Some are applying with additional degrees, which is great. It shows that you're smart. What you have to be careful of in that case is make sure you don't come across as just simply someone that's what we call a degree collector. I hate to use those quote things, but you know, the MBA is a degree to go on and be successful in business, right, or in government, or in whatever. But you know, typically AdCom is not looking for it as a route to further academics. Have you taken additional coursework? So maybe your undergraduate wasn't perfect and you have a couple of blips, or maybe it was a liberal arts degree and you don't have any math. But you've taken supplemental coursework and you're using your initiative and your self-awareness to ratchet up and get ready for the MBA. So that's a good thing. Then obviously the schools are looking at your test scores, and you know, these test scores seem to go up and up. The average test scores each year, we're looking at averages around 730 now on the GMAT for the very top schools, which is crazy. When I was at Wharton in sort of 2005, I think the average was sort of around 690 or something like that. And they were wickedly smart people. So I don't know how you guys are scoring all these very high test scores. But anyway, the point is, just make sure your test scores, whether the GMAT or the GRE, is your best score. So let me ask you my final poll question. Hopefully it comes up. How many times have you taken the GMAT and or the GRE? So how many times have you taken a standardized test to get ready for your applications? Of which some of you might not have taken it yet at all, which is, if you're applying in round one, you've got a lot of work to do, I suppose. So let's see if we get a quick answer on that. Interesting. So the modal score, I guess the most common score, is actually twice. Once, 3 times. For a few of you, more than 3 times. So there you go. That's actually probably reasonably representative, even though we're dealing with quite small numbers. But the point is, you really want to represent your best score. And if you're not satisfied with your score, and if you think with different preparation you could have performed better, then that's probably what you need to do. If you can get your score around the average of the schools you're applying, then don't I wouldn't worry about trying to you know, get it much higher in that. These sort of numbers again establish that you are admissible, that you will do well academically in our program. Brilliant. It's going to be mostly the rest of your application that's going to determine your success actually in the admission. So if we could move to the next slide, please, Mike. Great. So professional experience is very important, sort of measure of who you are, and MBA admissions is looking for people from myriad experiences. So there's not one professional experience that's important, but that you've done well wherever you've been. Can you show impact? Have you made a difference through your 2, 3, 4, or 5 years of professional experience that maybe someone else in your role didn't? And how can you show that impact that you've made in a measurable fashion? So have you helped innovate some product at work that's sort of generated some revenue? Have you done something at work that's sort of saved some budget money? Or whatever it might be that you can represent in some measurable format would be fantastic. Obviously, your recommenders too can also talk to your impact at work, which would be very important. But you really want to show that you're an impact person. And if you're one of the guys applying to the very top, Harvard and Stanford, you're going to be a person that's created impact in all your walks of life, whether it was during your undergraduate studies, whether it's in your non-professional experience or your professional experience. They're looking for impact people. So as you articulate your professional experience, make sure that can come across. We're also, or outcomes also, and it doesn't matter if you're a consultant or a banker or worked in non-profit, or, you know, there's a variety of types of experiences that set you up for your MBA. But were you one of the impact people within your domain? Also look at your success relative to peers. So we can look at the promotions that you've acquired, the bonuses and various other things to sort of help us understand how you've been successful. And we're also going to look at your career progression more broadly and look to see how you've made decisions to sort of transition your career or whatever it might be to move forward. And that might be promotions within one firm, or it might be moving firms, or it might be switching industries if you've decided you're going to pursue something a little bit different. You've got to understand, as I'm sure you do, your professional experience as articulated. It'll be in your resume, in your essays, in your data forms, in your recommendations. Your professional experience is going to be really, really important. All right, Mike? But we're not, or not we, again, I'm not an outcome anymore, but they're not only focused on career people. We also want people that are well-rounded, that are very interesting and have done interesting things outside of work. So you're not the person that just burns the midnight oil at the firm, goes home, goes to sleep, comes back and burns the midnight oil and has no other life. I mean, that's great, but we'd actually quite like to see people that have other interests in life and pursue those interests in a myriad ways. It's also nice that you show that you care, not just about your own success and your own career success, but you care about other things. My passion is horses, and I've gotten involved in a variety of different capacities dealing with the horse slaughter issue in the United States. And it's something that I've always been passionate about, and that sort of helps make me, I guess, who I am. But think about things that sort of show that you care about things other than just your own individual success. Also consider that your extracurricular activities, your volunteer activities, your hobbies or your interests are areas where you can show additional leadership. And sometimes it's easier to show leadership in these avenues than it is in your professional career as you're early on in your career, right? So you're not actually managing people yet, or many of you aren't. And this might be an opportunity for you to actually run with the project and do some interesting things outside of work. It's also a great way to show your passion. And you know, MBA programs want passionate people for the most part anyway. Passion is a good thing. Finally, Some of you are like, well, this is actually a bit of a stumbling block because I haven't really done a lot lately. And I've been really busy at work. I'm a consultant. I'm traveling all over the place, and it's crazy. I'm banking and I'm working these wicked hours. And AdCom understands this. But they're going to want to see something in your background. So, you know, what about your extracurriculars when you're in college? Were you a leader in college and so forth? And you're going to bring that behavior to our MBA program, because they want people involved in their community, leading their conferences and their clubs and so forth. So this, I would say this is a really important slide, especially for those of you considering the sort of Harvard and Stanford and the very, very top schools. They're used to getting people with great professional experience. But what oftentimes differentiates a candidate is also having great volunteer and extracurricular experiences also. Okay, Mike, next slide, please. Okay, here's something that people dismiss a little bit as important, but again, I would say it's super important: your goals. You're planning to pursue an MBA, there must be a reason for you to do that. Not just because that's what everyone else does. You want to have a real passion for some long-term goal that you want to be successful at, and the MBA is part of that pathway to get there. And you need to articulate that, and it might be in an essay. A lot of schools ask it directly in an essay. Might be in your data forms, could be in the interview, it could be in all three, but this is actually quite an important part of the application. But it's an important exercise for yourself to go through to really understand why you're pursuing an MBA and investing considerably in your professional development. It's not a cheap proposition. So why are goals important? It shows that you're very ready, right? Schools want people that are ready. You'll make the most of the MBA experience if you know why you're there. You're not going to try to recruit for consulting and banking, which is probably impossible at most schools anyway. And then tech comes along and you're confused by that. And you know, then, you know, one of the big corporate development programs sounds interesting, and it's all very confusing. You're just not going to make the most of your 2-year experience if you go in with that sort of level of preparation. Also, it helps you in your research of the schools and convincing the schools you know why you're going there if it fits into your goals. So now you can convince Duke that they're your #1 program because you want to go into healthcare and you want to be in that sort of Raleigh-Durham triangle area, whatever it's called. So you know the school. And not forgetting, as I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, there's way more admissible candidates than there are seats in the class. So a school is going to be much more likely to want to take a candidate that's got a good goal focus than one that the school thinks, well, you know what, I'm not sure what they're going to do when they get here, and it's going to be a bit of a risk, and they might not recruit well, and so on and so forth. So goals are important. With your goals, be ambitious. Right? Schools want successful alumni that change the world. So each of the schools that you apply, look at their mission statements. They all point to having a big footprint on the future of business in the world, however that might be. And how do they do that? That's with their successful alumni. So you're going to want to be ambitious. That said, you're also going to want to be realistic. Not everyone can be Elon Musk, which is a shame, right? But nor should they be, I suppose. But you know, make sure you have good ambition, but make sure it does tie, like you can show when you're in an interview, you can defend your ambitious goals by your career to date, getting the MBA, your short-term goal, preparing you for your path going forward, and show why the individual school can help you execute on those goals. Okay, Mike? Okay, your recommendations, if you're applying in round 1, hopefully you've already identified who your recommenders will be. Hopefully you've got a supervisor who is positive for your ambition to pursue an MBA, and you work with a period of time and will provide depth and detail and anecdotes to support your candidacy. So that will be something that the AdCom will look for If you don't have your recommender, or your recommender, that's silly. If you don't have your immediate supervisor recommending you, you probably need to write in the optional essay how you came to your choice of recommenders. And there are a variety of reasons why you might not have a direct supervisor recommending you. You might have worked with the person for a shorter period of time. The company might not be pro MBA, and so on and so forth. You might be an entrepreneur. And just come up with the right people that can objectively, i.e. not family, not people below you in your hierarchy of your firm, but can objectively provide detail and anecdotes that support your candidacy. So it might be clients, if you're an entrepreneur, could be a variety of different people. Make sure you waive your rights to review the recommendation. That's standard in the industry. If you don't do it, it might raise a potential trust issue that you have with your recommender, which isn't good. Prep your recommenders. So don't just say, can you recommend me? Here's the link to Harvard Business School, and so on and so forth. You want to make sure the recommender knows why you're applying to Harvard Business School, what your goals are, a copy of your resume, highlight anecdotes that you feel that it would be great for your recommenders to address. Be very strategic. Make sure your recommenders answer the questions. I've heard some schools say, you know what, well, if they don't answer these questions in detail, as long as we get a general sense from the recommender, 1 or 2 pages, that's going to be fine. Please don't do that. Don't forget, the school wants to know that you want to be at their school. And one way of not addressing that is by not answering their specific questions. So if TUC has a certain set of questions and your recommender doesn't answer them directly, then if I'm TUC AdCom, I'd be like, well, you know what, we're probably not a priority for this candidate, and it might affect our decision making. I'm not saying it does at TUC, but I'm just throwing that out as an example. And I know like Stern has very different sort of approach to recommendations with their EQ questions. So make sure that they are answered correctly or accurately. And then you need to follow up with those recommenders. Make sure they're on track. You've only got 2 weeks to get those first applications in. So sit down with them, ask them how they're doing and so forth. If they submit their recommendations late, I think there are some schools like Harvard might say, well, if it comes in the next 2 or 3 days, we're fine, but after that, not so fine. But it's down to your management and your judgment of the process if you pick recommenders that are just not going to bat for you and do things on time. So make sure you follow up, make sure they're on track. They've got 2 weeks to go. All right, Mike? Data forms. This is often the part of the application that is sort of dismissed, and it's really important. These are a very important part of the application. Why are they important? Because basically they provide context for your essays, right? So it's kind of hard to address the essays if you don't know what else has been asked in the sort of the short questions and so on and so forth. So if you haven't spent time on the data forms yet and you're going through the themes of your essays and that, I would suggest tonight, look at those data forms, answer them accurately, spend your time, draft those answers and so forth, and then go back to your essay themes. That would be very important. What we've seen over the last 10 years maybe is more questions have shifted from the long essays to the shorter prompts in the data forms, and there are reasons for that. Maybe it's trying to avoid consulting firms influencing the process a little bit, but data forms are very important, so make sure you know that. There are some tricky questions in there. So some schools like to ask what other schools you apply, and that's very hard. I would suggest addressing that question just very strategically, being honest about the schools you're applying, but then being very firm about why their school is your best choice. Parental information is another often question that's sought after in the data forms. And this can also be sort of misinterpreted in terms of why they're asking this question. So some people think, well, if I got, wealthy parents and they've gone through good education and this, that, and the other, I'll put that in. That's a good thing. Someone else, is first generation college and, had working class parents and so on and so forth. Which is better from a candidate standpoint? It really does depend. So you can imagine that the latter person has actually really succeeded, given the sort of the context from where she came. So that's fantastic. The admissions committee takes that into account. And some people would argue, well, the person from the wealthy background, that's good because he's, he's had good sort of experiences at a young age and so on and so forth. They've got a lot of resources. Maybe that's important for us to bring them in. I don't know. They'll be more apt to donate to the school or something. So don't. I guess my point here is don't try to assume why they're asking these questions. Just answer them correctly. And like I say, you're building a story with all these different questions, whether it's data form questions, the answers to your rec questions, your essays, and so forth. And a good AdCom is going to interpret that story. One part of the data forms mostly is asked is for your resume. Don't just submit your work resume without editing it. And the reason for that is you can't assume that your AdCom knows your industry jargon. So just like we recommend with your essay writing, get rid of any industry jargon, make sure it's readable from someone that's not in human resources within your industry. And mostly it has to be one page. So that's data forms, Mike. And essays, I've left this to last, and it might be the most important part of your application. It's really how you're going to convey your qualities and your work experience in stories and so on and so forth. So what I suggest, and I do this in my book, Becoming a Clear Admit, which is another plug. It's freely available. I don't even think you need to register to get it off of our site. And it's short and to the point. So hopefully it's a good read. Create what I call a personal inventory. So before drafting your essays, identify all your stories that highlight all the sort of attributes that schools find interesting. So it might be different leadership examples. Maybe you've had leadership experience at work without authority. That's pretty cool. So leadership from behind, showing some behavior for innovation, your teamwork experiences that highlight your values, and so on and so forth. So, and even the experiences that have not turned out well. Oftentimes schools ask an essay question on identifying a mistake and its consequences. And what you have to do then is show how you've learned from that mistake. And if you haven't made mistakes, I'm seeing a colleague of mine on chat, now I've got to behave. If you haven't made any mistakes, then AdCom says, well, you've just not got out of your comfort zone, you've not tried hard enough. So everybody's made mistakes, right? So anyway, identify all these stories before then addressing your essays. And as you address the essays on each of your applications, think holistically, right? So that you know that your Harvard application gives you a full view of who you are, then you know your Stanford or your Wharton or your Chicago, Duke or whatever. Be holistic about each application to the extent that you can. Answer the questions accurately. When I was an AdCom at Wharton with my colleague Eric Chambers, nothing delighted me more than when someone didn't answer a part of a question, because it was like, well, they're just not going to get admitted. And, we wanted to admit a lot of people, a lot of qualified people applied, but our admit rate was some ridiculous 15% or something like that. So if someone decided to omit a whole piece of a question in an essay, then that was an easy way for me to say, put this in the deny pile. And that's what we would do. So answer the questions accurately. Don't rehash question answers from other essays, and just read the questions properly, right? And write well, write in plain English, nothing fancy. You don't have to be an English literature sort of person to write good essays, but write in a very sort of easy to understand fashion. I would say your first paragraph is critical. You really want to engage your readers, who you've got to consider are reading lots and lots of these applications, individual sessions. I mean, when I was reading essays, it was overwhelming how much we had to read. Now I read for fun, which is actually quite nice. No jargon, just like in your resume. Get rid of your industry jargon. Make sure everything is easily explainable to someone that doesn't know your industry at all. Content and stories are important. Show, don't tell. Don't tell me that you're great. Give me a story that shows how great you are. I had on this slide, I hate to say it, but I put in brackets after the show, don't tell, unlike Trump. And then I was told to remove that because that's very political. And I'm not a political person, but Trump is very good at telling us stuff without actually showing us the detail. But, show, don't tell is very important. So you hear things like using the STAR approach or something like that to events and issues that you're addressing in your essays. And then get feedback. Don't be ashamed to get feedback. Everybody needs feedback. Even the greatest writers in the world get feedback and have editors helping them fine-tune their work. Mike, next slide. Finally, take a break. If you can, try to get your applications done prior to the deadline so you can take a bit of a break and then go for that final review. It's amazing if you can shut off for a couple of days what that final review will allow you to do. And then try to submit early. So don't leave it to the last minute. Again, when I was at Wharton, the big joke was, don't leave it to the last minute because who knows, these online applications might all crash. But quite honestly, I still think that's a bit of an issue, right? So as you imagine getting to the final minutes of the deadline, there's lots of people hitting the service. You don't want to get caught up in that last minute. So try to get your applications in a couple of days before. But also some schools, early is an advantage, right? So if you're applying to Kellogg and you want an on-campus interview, get that application in a week or two early so there's slots available for you to do that. You don't want to be waitlisted before the interview in that case, because that could be tricky. So I've rambled on. I'm sure that there might be questions I could answer directly. So Mike, is that the case, or can people now pose questions that I can answer directly?
Yes, absolutely. So we do have about 4 questions that are already in, so I can read them off for you to answer out loud. Yeah. For folks that have additional questions, feel free to continue to send them our way, and we'll get to as many as we can get to. So first, I just want to thank Alex I see you drinking some water. That was a great presentation thus far, and I think these questions fit right into all of the discussion thus far. So I'm just going to do them in the order that they came in, to be fair. So the first question was, are any of the schools concerned about how a candidate might fund their program, especially when the goal might be to return to their home country? So this is from an international candidate who's going to go to a different country for their program. Would funding the program have anything to do with them getting in or not?
It shouldn't. No. ADCOM is looking at your aspirations and goals and looking at how realistic they are, without looking at the financial side of it, right? So once you're admitted, the school will work with candidates in terms of send you over to the financial aid department to see if there's any funding available, if there's scholarships available, that's another route, and so on and so forth. But the admissions committee should not be making decisions based on your resources.
All right. Another question was, would there be any tips that you have on defining what your quote-unquote short-term goals would be versus the quote-unquote long-term goals, maybe in the sense of what admissions might be looking for, or is it just really showing your career track awareness? So they may have answered their own question, but that's what came in for us.
Yeah, I mean, I would think in the short term, obviously you're looking at where you're going to be directly out of the MBA. So you're going to want to look at the employment reports of a lot of these top schools and see where people go directly out of the MBA and see what makes most sense for you. For a lot of people, it's to go into consulting, and they use consulting for a couple of years to further sort of round out their skill set. So consulting is sort of the practical end of what they've learned in the MBA. So I would say if you're a little bit unclear of what you want to do post-MBA in the short term, then examine the consulting route. Obviously, MBA programs are quite well geared up for that route. But be passionate about a long-term goal. Don't try to make that up. Try to think of something that you're really interested in and can really hang your hat on, and make everything then make sense. AdCom is pretty good at sort of weeding out those that are making this stuff up. So if you really don't have a firm plan yet, really try to spend a few hours getting your head around it. And if you know some people that have got their MBA, now's the time to do some informational interviews and quiz them and see if they can help you develop a plan that makes sense for you. But I would say if you are unclear in the short term, then consulting is probably a good thing to look at.
All right. So next one that came in was more of a current career question in relation to how it would affect their application. Are entrepreneurs at a disadvantage compared to peers who may work at a brand name company, despite the schools claiming to be holistic and welcoming different diversity and different career paths?
I guess it depends how many businesses you've bankrupted as an entrepreneur to get to where you are. But even in that case, we like to see if you've learned from your experiences, right? So if you've gone through a couple of busts and now you're on track and doing quite well as an entrepreneur, that's good. But the reality is, our brand names, do they have an influence in admissions? Sure. As soon as I see the name Goldman Sachs or McKinsey or whatever, it's going to mean something, right? So anyone that says it's meaningless, I think is being a little dishonest. That said, it's just up to you as a candidate to explain your experiences and show how your experiences are rigorous. Remember that first slide or very early slide when I said there are three things you've got to articulate: the rigor of your experiences, both professional and non-professional, why you're different, and how you'll fit in. You hit those three, you're in great shape. So as an entrepreneur, it's just up to you to do the extra legwork to show the rigor of your experiences and how they compare to, or how they will compare to someone that's worked in banking or private equity or consulting, whatever, because those are the folks you're competing with. But you've also got to recognize that the school wants well-rounded class. They don't want a class just full of bankers or just full of consultants. Having a breadth of experiences in a classroom is critical to the learning process.
All right, on the career, looks like career is a popular topic here. So is it okay to have multiple short-term goals if they are similar? An example would be if your long-term goal of operations management can be achieved either through consulting or operations jobs at an industry company right out of school. Would you stick to one, or would you mention multiple?
The safe bet is stick to one, right? That's your safe bet. Stick to one and believe in it. Some schools will actually ask you, well, what if this doesn't work out? What's your fallback? Well, you've got an answer to that then, because you already had a backup plan. So I would say prioritize one step and focus on that in your application. But for those schools that then ask you directly, I know one school, I was looking at their essay questions the other day, I forget which one it was, says what happens if plan A doesn't work out, then obviously address plan B. But I just think it's less risky to stick to one route.
All right. So this is a question, and I'm going to combine a couple of questions here, but essentially we have one person who asked if you took additional coursework like MBA Math or Coursera or an HBX course, is it important to have that completed before you submit your application, or can you send a completion as a follow-up? And along with that, so those types of courses, but also doing like a Myers-Briggs assessment or a Big Five assessment to prep for your essay. So all these different types of prep opportunities, are they worth doing ahead of time, and do you need to finish them before you apply?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the Myers-Briggs approach, but in terms of preparation classes like MBA Prep Coursera and just taking classes at a community college, ideally you'd have them finished before you apply, and you get A's. Like, don't take any of these courses and get a B, because that's just not going to do you any good at all. So you want to get the top grade. That said, I think if you put in the optional essay, I'm undertaking this course, my grades are coming out, such and such in October, I'm going to send them to you directly as they come out, then I think at least you're alerting to the AdCom that you've undertaken this initiative. You show self-awareness, that's something that AdCom looks at, that this will help you prepare for the MBA, and these grades are coming in. As soon as they come in, I'm going to send them along. So I think you can adopt that approach. It's not ideal, but it's better than not. Better than not taking the course, for sure. And especially like if you don't have any math or calc and stat and that in your undergrad, you've got to take something to sort of gear yourself up. Or if you have some dodgy grades, I guess, you've got to do a bit of what we call transcript repair, right, to sort of fix that up. So show that you're taking the initiative. Don't let AdCom say you need to take these classes and we'll admit you. There you're running a risk. You're running a big risk. So I don't think I've given an ideal answer to that, but that's best. The other thing is it could be a bit of a school-by-school thing, so you might want to ask them directly.
All right. I think this is actually really good question, especially given the topic of our webinar series. From Ashley, and I'm just going to say her name because she asked me twice, so I'm going to make sure we get to her and she's paying attention. Is there ever an instance where it is more beneficial to apply in round 2 versus round 1?
Only if your application will be stronger in round 2.
Boom. Okay, so another question that came in.
And even in that case, if you're part of a competitive profile, you're running a risk delaying to round 2.
Yeah, essentially, I guess it comes down to being ready to apply round 1. If you're not ready to apply, then that would be an advantage to waiting for round 2. But obviously, there's going to be some risk in.
I mean, I'll throw a few myths out there, or try to dispel a few myths. People think it's easier to get in round 1 versus round 2. Again, unless you're part of a competitive profile, I don't think that's correct. You'll know the results sooner, but the admit rate in round 1 might be higher, but that's because the overall quality of candidates in round 1 is higher. And schools will use the wait list between rounds 1 and 2 to gauge where they're at. So you'll find a lot of candidates from round 1 will get placed on the wait list, and a good portion of candidates in round 2 are admitted off round 1 wait list. That's how they even it up between rounds 1 and round 2. Final round, avoid if you can. But rounds 1 and round 2, for people that are not from a truly wickedly competitive profile, it shouldn't matter. And my advice would be, if you're applying to 5 or 6 schools, I would pick 2 or 3 schools and apply in round 1, and then you're going to strengthen your applications in round 2 just through the learning curve you've gone through that application process. That first application you submit will not be your strongest application, which is ironic because Harvard is the first US-based school deadline in round 1.
All right, so we have like 1 or 2 more. If okay, Alex, is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine. The pub's still open when I get done. It's 6 o'clock here in England time.
There you go. So there, okay. As long as we make it before pub close, we're okay here.
Yeah.
So a good one for a resume question, and this is actually a pretty good question here. So we already talked about making sure that the language on the resume is appropriate for kind of the average reader. But this question is for the bullet points within your resume. Is it a good idea to provide the how something was accomplished, or just focus on what you accomplished and then leave the how as something you can bring up during an interview?
Yeah, and the how might also be in your essays, or I suppose even in your data forms, where you've got more space to actually type some stuff in your professional experiences. So, your resume, you're really only going to get sort of, one page. So you can't add a whole lot of context, but the rest of your application should help support the successes that you identify in your resume. We do have a resume guide. I think it's pretty good. You could look at. The other debate about resumes is whether to include a summary of the objective at the top or not. Obviously, by doing that, you're taking up some additional space. Some of my colleagues argue vehemently that you shouldn't do it because everyone's objective is to get into the MBA program. I remember, though, when I interviewed at Wharton, I loved it when I had a resume that had an objective statement at the top that explained why they're getting the MBA and what their goals are. Just made life a lot easier. So I would include a short objective that explains why I'm getting the MBA, and keep the bullets to sort of the highlights, and the rest of the application should help support that, I think.
All right. A question that was asked multiple times, maybe by the same person, not sure. Many schools are offering administration assistants. Is it a good idea to work with those people?
What's an administrative assistant?
Yes, I am unsure. So hopefully they can provide a little more feedback there, so you figure out exactly what that means. So we'll switch to a different question, and maybe they can continue to respond on that. So there's a good question that I guess continues to pop up in data forms. What would you do if you do not get in this year? However, there's also a question that asks, why do you want to get an MBA now? So how can you answer both of those questions without contradicting yourself?
Well, that is, I can't tell you that admissions committees are the best people at writing essay questions and data form questions, unfortunately. And having been on the other end of it, helping craft some of this stuff, I understand how tough it can be. Why now is important. We want to know why you're ready for this experience. And a lot of that's to do with your goals and your goal focus and your transition to your goals and so forth. So if you lack goal focus, that's a clear signal you're not ready for the MBA, and your why now is not going to work. So you're going to have to hit the why now. But, if you aren't successful getting your MBA, a lot of schools are looking to see if you're going to plan to reapply. I think Harvard throws out the stat that about 10% of its class are reapplicants from previous years, although I think that might be inflated a little bit by their early admissions thing for people straight out of undergrad. But nevertheless, reapplicants are treated quite well in the admissions process. We respect people's conviction that they want to pursue an MBA, and they're coming back at it again. They tend to be more focused as reapplicants, and they tend to have fixed stuff that admissions committees had identified in their applications, whether it's better test scores, more focused goals, better understanding of the individual school that denied them in the first place. So, I would try to answer both those questions as forthrightly and as honestly as you can. Try not to contradict yourself, I suppose, especially if there's sequential questions. That's a bit awkward.
All right, I have some additional information on the administration question. So the administration assistant would be referred to as somebody who is offering to review resume, review your essay, answer questions about the school. So it's someone from the office at the school looking to look at a time.
If a school provides that service, why wouldn't you? Absolutely. Yeah. And some schools probably do provide some kind of service. It won't be your Harvard and Stanford because they don't really need to, but schools maybe a little bit lower down the pyramid of whatever. They're trying to help candidates. They want to understand candidates more clearly so that they can make a better decision whether to admit them or not.
Perfect. And then we do have one here, and this is a really good question. So since you have experience reviewing applications, have you had any standout candidates coming from non-traditional business backgrounds? So the example here would be education. If so, what do you believe creates a standout candidate from that type of a population?
Well, I think wherever you're from, if you've shown this behavior of creating impact, as I mentioned earlier, that's important. So it could be in the education setting. You've helped design a new field of study in your institution or whatever it might be. I mean, there are various ways to make impact. So I wouldn't worry about that as long as you can articulate that your work has been rigorous. As I mentioned earlier, you made impact. Boom, and you could do that across myriad fields. And then what you have to understand is, as an AdCom, tonight I might have 20 applications to read through. So I'm going through this consultant and that consultant and this banker and bank. And then boom, I got an application from someone that's got a completely different industry experience. It's actually quite refreshing. I'm not saying it gives you an advantage, but it might actually make me focus a little bit more on your application, I suppose, to learn a bit more about something I know less about. So that's quite good. But focus on the rigor of your experiences and your impact.
All right. It looks like that is all of the outstanding questions that we have. Let me just double check that I think we caught everything. And we should be all set. I guess the only other one was that it was a little further up, so I apologize. But if you have with recommendation responses, if you have a current supervisor who agreed to give your recommendation but does not know what to say for the critical feedback question. So essentially, I guess, how important is it to use the supervisor if they can't fully answer all of the questions?
I mean, some people struggle, like their supervisor might, English might not be their first language, so that becomes a bit of an issue. But I've not heard of a supervisor that struggles with one particular question. And, I think it's within the spirit of the game, as it were. That as a candidate, you could say, well, what about this issue? You provided me critical feedback then. Can you use that particular issue, that experience or whatever to address that question? But, as an AdCom, we expect flaws in candidates, and we expect them to have received feedback based on those flaws. And we want to see how they've learned from that feedback. So that's your critical aspect. There is, all right, so you've had an issue. How did you respond to that feedback? And how you responded is oftentimes more important than the issue itself that initially needed addressing. But to the extent that you as a candidate can sort of help your recommender addressing the questions, as long as you're not writing it, but you're sort of reminding them of instances and providing them some material like that, I think that's fine. And one thing that we do at Clear Admit is we do make public, or whatever you want to call it, we highlight the recommendation questions so that you can see them, and it's not just the recommender that sees them. So you can go to our site and look at what the recommendation questions are if you're not familiar with them.
All right. Well, I think with that, I think it's about time that we start to wrap up. What I will say is, and we had this a couple of times in the chat that I was able to answer by typing back, If there are people who are looking to get a little more feedback on their profile and their list of schools, and honestly, some of the items that we've already addressed during today's webinar, one really great feature on clearadmit.com is our MBA Apply Wire. And we have folks like Alex, actually, who will comment on candidates' profiles to assist you in making sure that you're choosing the correct target schools, answering some of the questions that you may have. And it's a really great community that we've built on the website to assist you in moving forward with your applications. So we did have a couple of people ask if we do individual reviews, and that is a really great way to do it. And, Alex, if you have anything to comment on that, I think that's a really good place for people to go next as they're looking for advice.
Yeah, ApplyWire is great, and I answer all the entries each morning. So any new entries, I'll answer it tomorrow morning, my time, when I'm in the UK. And you can just search ApplyWire, get to see how other people got their feedback, and so on and so forth. So it's very good at this stage of your application. ClearAdmit partners, I think, with Veritas Prep, and they will provide, like any other admissions consulting firm, I suppose, they'll provide some kind of free 30-minute review of your candidacy. Obviously, they're using that to try to sign you up, which is fine. But that could also be, that 30-minute call could also help too. But the ApplyWire, obviously, for us, if you use that, I will answer those questions, and hopefully that helps you. And I just want to say I've actually enjoyed. I'm quite new to the webinar medium, I guess is the right thing. So I've very much enjoyed hosting this webinar, and really look forward to doing it again next Wednesday.
Yes, and Alex, that's a great segue. So for those of you who have registered and are interested in attending for our Part 2, you will receive the information for the login for Part 2 probably by the end of today. So we'll get that loaded up and sent out to you. The recording of today's webinar will be available on clearadmit.com by the end of this week. And if you have not registered for Part 2 and you are interested in doing so, please return back to clearadmit.com, and you will see a lot of information about Part 2 next Wednesday at the same time. So I do want to thank Alex for being our host and our presenter for today's session. This was really, really great information. And if you liked what you heard today, come back next week to learn a little bit more. And in between, maybe go on to MBA ApplyWire and share with us some of your application profile data and some of your interested target schools. And hopefully we'll be able to give you some really good tips and advice specific to your individual situation. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. We're about to sign off. And thanks again to Alex.
Thank you, guys. Take care.